HAL Laboratories and Satoru Iwata helped Nintendo lift off with their next 1986 game, Balloon Fight. We're now shoulder deep in the black box set. We've seen several third parties develop games, later published by Nintendo. IREM had two, 10-Yard Fight and Kung Fu, but the clear favorite of Nintendo was HAL Laboratories. This is the third and final black box game published by HAL. The previous titles, Golf, Pinball, Mach Rider, and F1 Race as a Japanese exclusive, all held a certain level of polish that surpassed the average black box game. And this makes sense. At its core, HAL was an establishment with one particularly skilled programmer, Satoru Iwata. I've talked about Iwata's previous accomplishments, including his skills at data compression, showcased through the inclusion of 18 holes in golf, and how his creative vision allowed Mach Rider to take shape. Balloon Fight is very different from those two games. In fact, it's arguably one of the most unique games in the entire set. Not because it broke new ground, far from it, but because it is a nearly identical copy to Williams Electronics' popular 1982 game, Joust. Say what you will about Nintendo's black box lineup, it has its fair share of absolute garbage. Stack up. But each game, regardless of their critical success, does bring something new to the table. Seeing a clone of an already successful arcade title on Nintendo's home console seems antithetical to their entire approach to the market in America. So how did Balloon Fight get past Nintendo's filter? Nintendo wasn't always the company focused on forging its own path that we know of today. A lot of their early game development history involved ripping off popular arcade games. For example, one of their earliest video games, Radar Scope, bore striking resemblance to Galaxian. The Famicom's Devil World was very similar to Pac-Man, and the list goes on. Nintendo had been in the business of copying ideas for video games for years. However, even the other black box game that seems to be inspired, this word is taking on a heavy load here, by Pac-Man, Clu Clu Land added something to the genre. It's true that Balloon Fight's first two game modes are blatant copies of Joust, but I don't intend to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's important to acknowledge its third mode, Balloon Trip, which added a good deal of depth to the game. This, combined with a few mechanical differences and a more playful styling, changed up Joust's formula enough for Balloon Fight to remain a relevant title to this day. This dive into black box games is mostly focused on the console release rather than the arcade versus system versions, so I should clarify that Iwata and HAL Laboratories worked on the home console port of Balloon Fight, not the versus system version. Just like many of the other versus system versions of black box games, there are many differences between the two. Iwata's work on the NES version improved the physics from that of the versus system, changed the enemy AI, and added the balloon trip mode, which is what I'm focusing on here. Now let's get back on topic. Before I get into the divergences, let's go through the gameplay similarities between Joust and Balloon Fight. The goal of game modes A and B are to fly above enemies. This is what they're officially notated as in the manuals. I cannot identify the species that these fall under. To knock them out of the air. While they're falling, the player has to hit them again, causing them to fall into the water and disappear. Joust's premise is nearly the same. The player is also tasked with knocking their opponents out of the air and hitting the egg that falls before it hatches into another ostrich. A few different enemies also pose a challenge. In Balloon Fight, lightning can strike, causing a small electric ball to fly around the screen, taking a life from the player if run into. Joust has a pterodactyl that will spawn and is impossible to defeat, serving much the same purpose as lightning. In both games, flying requires mashing the A button repeatedly. The physics of this movement in the game's NES releases are remarkably similar, likely because they were both programmed by Iwata. Yes, the NES port of Joust was developed by HAL Laboratories as early as 1983, and was actually the first game that Iwata ever worked on, according to this interview with Yash Terakura, a co-worker of his during the time. It's not too far-fetched to conclude that Balloon Fight is just a reskinned version of Joust. During a time when Nintendo was likely struggling to find ideas for games to release on both the Famicom and NES, it would make sense for them to turn to some previously rendered games for inspiration. Joust didn't actually come out for the NES until 1988, meaning Balloon Fight didn't have a whole lot of competition on the home console. So yeah, the two games were extraordinarily similar, and this could probably explain why. Balloon Fight did change a lot to make it more appealing and accessible to the NES's target audience in America. The ostrich fighters were replaced with colorful balloons, and the flying animation was changed to show the little man flapping behind him to achieve liftoff. The art design and graphics are also far superior to Joust's. Once again, Nintendo's less realistic approach let them produce a title that still looks quite good over 35 years later. In addition to the graphics getting an overhaul, the gameplay was made to be more forgiving. In Joust, the player can only get hit a single time before they lose a life. The little guy in a balloon fight, who actually doesn't have a name, has 2 balloons attached to his helmet, meaning he can take 2 hits before perishing. However, when the player only has 1 balloon to work with, it does become more difficult to properly steer when flying. It was quite the feat to code this into the limited memory of an NES card, and it adds to the already impressive flying physics present. This wasn't the only improvement between the titles. Balloon Fight had 12 unique sets of stages before looping, while Joust reused the same layout endlessly. Another small detail changed was the hitbox of the player character. In Joust, if the player was hit anywhere on their body, they would be killed. Balloon Fight changed the hitboxes such that only bonks to the top of the head counted. The extra mistakes these allow for adds much leeway in gameplay, which is especially helpful in later stages, when a dozen enemies can assault the player at a time. Where the two games really diverged, though, was with Balloon Fight's third mode, Balloon Trip. This adventure added several hours of fun to the gameplay, repurposing the physics of the main game and throwing them into a collectathon of balloons over the open ocean. The bonus music plays throughout this section, showcasing Hirokazu Tanaka's excellent composition. This was one of the first games to play a theme throughout all of gameplay, and in many ways revolutionized how sound interacted with the medium. If you want more info on that, be sure to check out my video on how the Famicom raised the bar for video game music as a whole. That's the extent of what Balloon Fight has to offer. It may seem that a game that was based off of another title might not have a lot to its name, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Arguably, Balloon Fight's biggest impact comes in the form of a game we've already discussed as part of the 1985 releases, Super Mario Bros. Toshihiko Nakago, one of the programmers for Versus Balloon Fight, repurposed Iwata's improved physics for Mario's swimming physics in Super Mario Bros. When playing the two back-to-back, this is very clear. They're both smooth and as precise as they should be for underwater and aerial movement. Balloon Fight is also one of the few black box games to receive a true sequel in Balloon Kid for the Game Boy. This relatively simple game built off of the concept of Balloon Trip, fleshing out the side-scrolling adventure into a full-on platformer, if you were flying and you couldn't jump. It added a variety of new enemies and environments, including multiple stages and an actual plot. It even featured bonus stages that mimicked balloon fights, letting the player pop as many balloons as possible to earn points and potentially an extra life. This wasn't Nintendo's only callback to Balloon Fight. Of course, it received the treatment that many other popular black box games did. A cameo in Animal Crossing, an e-reader card pack, and several Super Smash Bros. Appearances, including a theme stage in Super Smash Bros. For 3DS. In 2012's Nintendo Land, a game featuring a theme park of Nintendo's most notable IPs through the years, Balloon Fight's breakout game mode received a beautiful remaster in the form of Balloon Trip Breeze. This multi-staged game serves as the third entry in the Balloon Fight franchise, at least in my eyes. It remains faithful to the original concept, continues to build off of the many features added in Balloon Kid, and updates the graphics, sound, and level design of both. Similarly to the likes of the Wii Sports and Wii Play series reworking the basic designs of the Sports series and Light Gun series games respectively, Balloon Trip Breeze changes the controls to work with the Wii U gamepad, letting the player swipe to make a gust for their on-screen Mii. The big difference is that this game didn't feel like just a tech demo. It's a full-fledged experience. In fact, I would argue that Balloon Fight's Balloon Trip spawned a genre of flight-based action platformer games. Balloon Fight was the first title that worked off of this formula, but it has since blossomed into several other spheres. D-Pad Studios' Owlboy is an action platformer that uses flight as its main movement mechanic. It's significantly more complex than any game I've mentioned so far, adding a multitude of actions, such as combat, ferrying, and more, but it does bear the hallmark of the genre. This captures the platformer aspect of Balloon Kid, but the endlessness of Balloon Trip can be seen in games like Half-Brick's Jetpack Joyride. The player doesn't get to move horizontally, unlike Balloon Trip, but the collecting of coins and special items is incredibly reminiscent of the popping of balloons and destruction of bubbles present in Balloon Trip. It's unlikely that the designers were actively aware of Balloon Fight while Jetpack Joyride was in development, but it acts as a spiritual successor nonetheless. These next are relatively minor, but still important little tidbits. In 2007, Club Nintendo, Nintendo's old rewards program, put out Tingle's Balloon Fight, a Japanese exclusive game featuring Tingle from the Legend of Zelda franchise. It's literally just Balloon Fight with a Legend of Zelda skin, but it's still a cute little spin-off. And lastly, Nintendo DSi Instrument Tuner, a piece of downloadable software for the DSi, features a mode called Tuner Fight, which borrows the sounds and graphics from Balloon Fight, but functions like a rhythm game. Why Nintendo chose to do this is anyone's guess, but it is cute. That wraps up our look at Balloon Fight. It may be a Joust clone at heart, but it expanded on it so much that to boil it down to a simple clone would devalue a number of actual clones Nintendo made previously. Its physics were revolutionary, its stylized graphics are still fun to look at, and its bonus mode's premise was so exciting that it single-handedly started a genre of floating platformers, spawning more than one sequel. Balloon Fight is a solid title with a solid legacy, and that's not me just blowing hot air.